In the midst of a devastating famine, two names became feared across Mosul: Abboud and Khajawa. As hunger swept through the city and families struggled to survive, whispers began to circulate about a couple whose actions would shock an already suffering community. Their story, set against the backdrop of war, scarcity, and social collapse, would become one of the most chilling chapters in Mosul's history. Today, we journey back to a time when desperation blurred the lines between right and wrong, and the unthinkable became reality. Let us know which country or state you're listening from. We love to know where our history community is watching from. Mosul, in the early years of the 20th century, was a city at the crossroads of empires, cultures, and, at times, calamity. Nestled along the banks of the Tigris River, its ancient streets had witnessed centuries of prosperity and hardship. But in the years leading up to 1917, Mosul and its surrounding regions faced one of the darkest chapters in their long history. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened by war and internal strife, was gripped by a famine so severe that it would test the very limits of human endurance. To understand the story of Abboud and Khajawa, we must first understand the world in which they lived, a world unraveling at the seams. The First World War raged across continents, and the Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power, was now beset by military defeats, blockades, and internal dissent. The war had disrupted trade routes and agricultural production, and the empire's resources were stretched to the breaking point. In Mosul, as in much of the empire, food became scarce and hunger became a daily reality. The famine that struck Mosul was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding descent into deprivation. Crops failed, livestock perished, and the price of basic staples soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. Bread, once a symbol of hospitality and abundance, became a luxury. The city's markets, once bustling with traders and farmers, grew quiet as supplies dwindled. For many, survival meant making impossible choices. It was in this crucible of suffering that the names Abboud and Khajawa would become infamous. Their story is not one of monsters, but of people, shaped and ultimately broken by the world around them. Abboud and Khajawa were, by all accounts, an ordinary couple before the famine. They lived in a modest home on the outskirts of Mosul, in a neighborhood where families knew each other by name and children played in the narrow alleys. Abboud, a man in his early 40s, was known as a laborer, sometimes working in the fields, sometimes taking odd jobs in the city. Khajawa, his wife, was a homemaker, tending to their small household and raising their only son. Neighbors would later recall that the family had always struggled to make ends meet, even before the famine. They were not wealthy, but neither were they outcasts. Like many in Mosul, they relied on the rhythms of the seasons and the support of their community. But as the famine deepened, those rhythms were shattered, and the bonds of community began to fray. The Ottoman authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, were unable to provide effective relief. Food convoys were often intercepted or looted before reaching the city. Disease spread quickly among the malnourished population, and the death toll mounted. In the face of such hardship, even the most basic acts of kindness became rare. People hoarded what little they had, and trust gave way to suspicion. For Abboud and Khajawa, the struggle to survive became all-consuming. Their son, a boy of about 10, was often seen accompanying his parents as they searched for food or work. The family's descent into desperation was not unique. Across Mosul, countless others faced the same daily battle against hunger. But as the months wore on, rumors began to circulate about the couple. Whispers in the marketplace, furtive glances from neighbors, signs that something was amiss. The famine's impact on Mosul was not only physical, but psychological. Hunger gnawed at the body, but it also eroded the social fabric. Long-standing traditions of hospitality and charity were tested as never before. The city's religious and community leaders urged solidarity, but their words often fell on ears dulled by exhaustion and fear. In such an environment, the line between right and wrong could blur, and acts once unthinkable became possible. Historical records from the period paint a grim picture. Contemporary accounts describe families forced to sell their possessions, their homes, even their children, in a desperate bid for survival. The Ottoman authorities, struggling to maintain order, imposed strict rationing and harsh penalties for theft. Yet these measures did little to stem the tide of suffering. It was against this backdrop that the first reports of disappearances began to emerge. At first, they were dismissed as the inevitable result of chaos, people fleeing the city in search of food, or succumbing to disease in the countryside. But as the number of missing grew, so too did the sense of unease. Abboud and Khajawa's home, once unremarkable, became the focus of suspicion. Neighbors noticed that the family seemed to fare better than most, that their son appeared healthier than other children. Some claimed to have seen strangers enter the house, never to emerge. Others spoke of strange odors, or of late-night activity behind shuttered windows. In the absence of concrete evidence, these rumors might have faded into the background noise of a city in crisis. But the famine had changed Mosul. Fear and suspicion were now as common as hunger. The community, once bound by trust, was now held together by little more than necessity. As we begin this journey into the story of Abboud and Khajawa, it is important to remember the context in which they lived. Their actions, however shocking, were shaped by forces far beyond their control. The famine that gripped Mosul was not merely a backdrop, but a central character in this tragedy, a force that tested the limits of human endurance and revealed the darkness that can emerge when survival is at stake. In the episodes that follow, we will explore the full scope of the famine's impact on Mosul, the growing sense of fear and suspicion, and the investigation that would ultimately bring Abboud and Khajawa to justice. Through historical records, witness statements, and contemporary reporting, we will seek to understand not only what happened, but why. This is the story of a city pushed to the brink, and of a couple whose names would become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in its history. To truly understand the events that would unfold in Mosul, we must first grasp the full magnitude of the famine that swept through the city and its surrounding countryside. The early 20th century was a period of profound upheaval for the Ottoman Empire. The First World War, which began in 1914, had drawn the empire into a conflict it was ill-prepared to fight. As the war dragged on, its effects rippled far beyond the battlefields, reaching deep into the daily lives of ordinary people. Mosul, a city with a rich history and a diverse population, found itself at the mercy of forces beyond its control. The war had disrupted trade routes that once brought grain, livestock, and other essentials from distant provinces. The Tigris River, which had long been a lifeline for the city, could no longer guarantee abundance. Instead, the riverbanks became a place where desperate families gathered, hoping to glean whatever scraps they could find. The Ottoman authorities, stretched thin by the demands of war, struggled to maintain order and provide for the population. Conscription had taken many able-bodied men from their homes, leaving fields untended and families without providers. The government's attempts at rationing were often undermined by corruption, inefficiency, and the sheer scale of the crisis. Food supplies dwindled and prices soared to unimaginable heights. For the people of Mosul, daily life became a relentless struggle against hunger. Bread, the staple of every meal, became scarce. Families who once enjoyed hearty stews and fresh produce now subsisted on thin gruel, if they were lucky. Children, once full of energy, grew listless and thin. The city's markets, once vibrant with the sounds of bargaining and laughter, fell silent as stalls stood empty and hope faded. Contemporary accounts from the period paint a vivid picture of the suffering. In letters, diaries, and official reports, the same themes recur: the gnawing pain of hunger, the desperation of parents unable to feed their children, the slow erosion of dignity as people were forced to beg or barter their last possessions for a morsel of food. Disease, always a threat in times of scarcity, spread rapidly among the weakened population. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery claimed lives by the hundreds. The social fabric of Mosul, so carefully woven over generations, began to unravel. Traditional networks of support, Extended families, religious charities, neighborhood associations were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of need. Those who still had resources were forced to make impossible choices, to help a neighbor, or to save what little they had for their own children. Acts of kindness became rare, and suspicion grew as people guarded their meager supplies. It was not only the poor who suffered. Even the city's wealthier families found themselves unable to escape the reach of the famine. Gold and silver could buy little when there was nothing left to sell. The city's elite, once accustomed to comfort and security, now faced the same daily anxieties as their less fortunate neighbors. Hunger, it seemed, was the great equalizer. The psychological toll of the famine was immense. Hunger does not merely weaken the body, it clouds the mind, erodes judgment, and breeds fear. In Mosul, as in other cities gripped by famine, people began to see the world through a lens of scarcity. Trust, once the foundation of community life, became a luxury few could afford. Rumors spread quickly, and every stranger was viewed with suspicion. Children were among the most vulnerable. Many were orphaned by disease or forced to fend for themselves when their parents could no longer provide. Some were sent to live with relatives in the countryside, where food was thought to be more plentiful, though this was often a false hope. Others simply disappeared, their fates unknown. The city's religious leaders did what they could to offer comfort and guidance. Mosques and churches became places not only of worship, but of refuge. Sermons urged patience and solidarity, reminding the faithful of the virtues of charity and compassion. Yet even the most devout struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the harsh realities of daily life. When survival is at stake, moral certainties can quickly give way to pragmatism. The Ottoman authorities, aware of the growing crisis, attempted to impose order through rationing and price controls. Grain was requisitioned from the countryside and distributed in the city, but the quantities were never enough. Black markets flourished, and those with connections or influence were often able to secure supplies that others could not. For the majority, however, each day was a test of endurance. It was in this environment of scarcity and fear that the first signs of social breakdown began to appear. Petty theft became common, as did more serious crimes. The city's jails, already crowded, filled with those accused of stealing bread or hoarding grain. The authorities responded with harsh punishments, hoping to deter others, but the underlying problem remained. There was simply not enough food to go around. As the famine dragged on, the sense of desperation deepened. People began to take risks they would never have considered in better times. Some sold their possessions, their homes, even their children, in a last-ditch effort to survive. Others left the city altogether, joining the growing ranks of refugees wandering the countryside in search of sustenance. For Abboud and Khajawa, as for so many others, the famine was a crucible. Their daily existence became a struggle to find enough food to keep themselves and their son alive. The choices they faced were stark, and the consequences of failure were dire. In such circumstances, the boundaries of acceptable behavior could shift in ways that would have been unimaginable only a few years before. The famine's impact was not limited to the physical and psychological suffering of individuals. It also reshaped the city's social landscape. Old hierarchies crumbled as the wealthy and the poor alike were brought low by hunger. New forms of authority emerged, based on access to food and the ability to provide for others. In some cases, this led to acts of heroism and self-sacrifice. In others, it opened the door to exploitation and abuse. As the months passed and the famine showed no sign of abating, the people of Mosul grew increasingly desperate. The city's leaders appealed to the Ottoman authorities for help, but their pleas went largely unanswered. International aid was slow to arrive, hampered by the ongoing war and the collapse of traditional supply routes. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, the seeds of tragedy were sown. The story of Abboud and Khajawa would soon become a symbol of the famine's darkest consequences, a reminder of what can happen when the bonds of community are stretched to the breaking point and the struggle for survival becomes all-consuming. As the famine in Mosul deepened, the city's daily rhythms changed in subtle but profound ways. streets that once bustled with commerce and conversation grew quieter. Families retreated indoors, conserving energy and resources. The city's public spaces, once alive with the sounds of children and merchants, became places of wary glances and hurried footsteps. It was in this altered landscape that the first reports of disappearances began to surface. At first, these vanishings were easy to overlook. In times of crisis, people often move in search of food or safety. Some families left Mosul for the countryside, hoping that rural relatives might have more to share. Others, weakened by hunger or disease, simply faded from public view. The city's population was in constant flux, and the absence of a neighbor or acquaintance could be explained away as another casualty of the times. But as the weeks turned into months, a pattern began to emerge. The number of missing people grew, and their disappearances could no longer be attributed solely to the chaos of famine. Neighbors began to notice that certain individuals, often those without close family, or those who were new to the city, seemed to vanish without a trace. The city's elders, who prided themselves on knowing every family in their quarter, found themselves unable to account for the growing list of absent faces. Contemporary records from Mosul's municipal authorities reflect this growing concern. Reports of missing persons increased sharply in 1916 and 1917, with many cases left unresolved. The city's limited police force, already stretched thin by the demands of maintaining order and distributing scarce resources, struggled to investigate each case. In many instances, there was little evidence to go on: no witnesses, no clear motive, and no bodies. The disappearances affected every part of Mosul's diverse community. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Yazidis alike reported missing relatives and friends. The city's religious leaders, who often served as intermediaries between families and the authorities, found themselves overwhelmed by requests for help. In sermons and public statements, they urged vigilance and mutual support, but their words did little to stem the tide of fear. For many, the disappearances were a source of quiet dread. Parents kept their children close, warning them not to stray far from home. Travelers moved in groups, wary of venturing out alone. The city's markets, already diminished by the famine, became places of whispered rumors and furtive glances. Every stranger was a potential threat, and every unexplained absence was a cause for suspicion. The psychological impact of the disappearances was profound. In a time when trust was already in short supply, the knowledge that people could vanish without explanation eroded what little sense of security remained. Some residents began to suspect that the famine had driven people to desperate acts: robbery, kidnapping, even murder. Others whispered of darker possibilities, invoking old tales of evil lurking in times of hardship. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that the names Abboud and Khajawa began to surface in conversation. At first, the couple was mentioned only in passing, one family among many struggling to survive. But as the disappearances continued, neighbors began to recall odd details: the family's apparent resilience in the face of hunger, the healthy appearance of their young son, the strangers seen entering their home. These observations, innocuous on their own, took on new significance in light of the city's growing anxieties. The role of rumor in times of crisis cannot be overstated. In Mosul, as in other communities facing disaster, information was often scarce and unreliable. News traveled by word of mouth, shaped by fear and speculation. Stories grew in the telling, and innocent coincidences could quickly become evidence of wrongdoing. The city's authorities, aware of the dangers posed by panic, urged residents to remain calm and report any suspicious activity. Despite these efforts, the sense of unease continued to grow. The disappearances became a topic of conversation in every household, every marketplace, every place of worship. Some residents took matters into their own hands, organizing informal patrols and keeping watch over their neighborhoods. Others withdrew further into isolation, trusting no one outside their immediate family. The impact of the disappearances was felt most acutely by the city's most vulnerable residents: orphans, widows, and the elderly. Those without strong social ties were at greatest risk. For these individuals, the loss of a friend or neighbor was not just a personal tragedy, but a threat to their very survival. In a city where every resource was precious, the disappearance of even one person could have far-reaching consequences. The authorities, for their part, struggled to respond. The city's police force, underfunded and understaffed, was ill-equipped to investigate a wave of missing persons cases. Many officers were themselves affected by the famine, and morale was low. The Ottoman administration, preoccupied with the demands of war and the broader crisis, offered little support. In this vacuum, local leaders did what they could, but their efforts were often hampered by a lack of information and resources. As the disappearances continued, some residents began to suspect that they were not random acts but part of a larger pattern. Theories abounded. Some blamed bandits or deserters from the Ottoman army. Others pointed to rivalries between different religious or ethnic groups. A few whispered that the famine had driven people to cannibalism, a taboo so profound that it was rarely spoken of openly. It is important to note that such rumors were not unique to Mosul. Throughout history, communities facing extreme hunger have often resorted to similar explanations for unexplained deaths and disappearances. The fear of cannibalism, whether real or imagined, is a reflection of the deep psychological trauma inflicted by famine. In Mosul, as in other places, these fears were both a symptom and a cause of social breakdown. For Abboud and Khajawa, the growing suspicion would soon become a matter of life and death. Their home, once a place of relative safety, became the focus of increasing scrutiny. Neighbors watched their movements, noted the comings and goings of visitors, and shared their observations with the authorities. The couple, aware of the attention, became more cautious, but the tide of suspicion was difficult to stem. As the city grappled with the ongoing crisis, the disappearances became a symbol of the famine's corrosive effects. They were a reminder that in times of extreme hardship, the bonds of community could be stretched to the breaking point. The story of Abboud and Khajawa, still unfolding, would soon bring these fears into sharp relief, forcing the people of Mosul to confront the darkest possibilities of human behavior under duress. As the famine's grip on Mosul tightened, the city's collective anxiety deepened. The disappearances, once scattered and explainable, now seemed to follow a pattern that was difficult to ignore. In the midst of this growing unease, attention increasingly turned to the household of Abboud and Khajawa. Their apparent resilience in the face of widespread deprivation and the healthy appearance of their young son stood in stark contrast to the suffering visible all around them. It was in this context that stories began to circulate about the couple's methods, how they might have lured victims into their home, and the possible role their son played in these events. These accounts, pieced together from witness statements, police records, and later court testimony, offer a window into the psychology of both the accused and the community that watched them with growing suspicion. According to several neighbors, Abboud and Khajawa were not reclusive. On the contrary, they maintained a presence in the neighborhood, engaging in small acts of commerce and conversation. Abboud was often seen in the markets, offering to help with odd jobs or seeking out those who appeared particularly desperate. Khajawa, too, was known to extend invitations to those in need, offering a place to rest, a cup of water, or the promise of a meal. In a time when hospitality was rare, such gestures stood out. It was these very acts of apparent kindness that, in retrospect, fueled suspicion. Some survivors later recalled that the couple seemed to target individuals who were isolated, travelers, beggars, orphans, and those without close family ties. These were the people most likely to accept an offer of food or shelter, and least likely to be missed if they disappeared. The couple's son, a boy of about 10, was sometimes seen playing in the streets, striking up conversations with other children or adults. Some witnesses claimed that he would invite them to his home, promising bread or a place to rest. The use of a child in this way, if true, speaks to the profound moral dislocation wrought by the famine. In ordinary times, children are seen as symbols of innocence and trust. But in Mosul's darkest days, even these boundaries could be crossed. The boy's involvement, whether voluntary or coerced, remains a subject of debate among historians. Some accounts suggest that he was simply following his parents' instructions, unaware of the consequences. Others believe he may have been a victim himself, caught in a web of desperation and fear. The couple's home, a modest dwelling on the edge of the city, became the focal point of these suspicions. Neighbors reported seeing strangers enter the house often late in the day, but rarely saw them leave. Some spoke of hearing muffled voices or seeing lights burning late into the night. Others noticed that the family seemed to have more food than most, and that their son was better clothed and fed than other children in the area. As the rumors grew, so did the sense of unease. The famine had already eroded the bonds of trust that held the community together, and now fear threatened to overwhelm what little remained. Some residents began to avoid the couple altogether, crossing the street to avoid passing their home. Others, driven by curiosity or concern, kept a careful watch on the family's movements, noting every visitor and every unusual occurrence. The role of the couple's son in these events is particularly poignant. In times of crisis, children are often the first to suffer, but they can also become unwitting participants in the survival strategies of adults. In later interviews, some of the boy's playmates recalled that he seemed lonely and withdrawn, rarely joining in games or laughter. Others remembered him as friendly and eager to please, always quick to offer a piece of bread or a kind word. Whether he understood the full extent of his parents' actions is a question that may never be answered. The methods attributed to Abboud and Khajawa were not unique to their case. Throughout history, famine has driven people to acts of deception and betrayal, as the struggle for survival overrides social norms and moral codes. In Mosul, as in other places, the promise of food or shelter became a powerful lure, one that could mean the difference between life and death. The couple's willingness to exploit this vulnerability speaks to the depths of desperation that the famine had created. It is important to note that much of what is known about the couple's methods comes from later testimony, often given under duress or in the context of public outrage. The line between fact and rumor is difficult to draw, and some details may have been exaggerated or distorted over time. Nevertheless, the consistency of the account suggests that there was a pattern to the disappearances, and that Abboud and Khajawa played a central role. The community's response to these suspicions was shaped by the broader context of the famine. With the authorities overwhelmed and resources scarce, many residents felt compelled to take matters into their own hands. Informal networks of surveillance and mutual aid sprang up, as neighbors banded together to protect themselves and their families. In some cases, this led to false accusations and acts of vigilantism. In others, it provided the first clues that would eventually lead to the couple's arrest. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. For those living through the famine, the knowledge that even acts of kindness could be a prelude to danger was deeply unsettling. The erosion of trust already advanced by months of hunger and deprivation now seemed complete. Every interaction was tinged with suspicion, and the boundaries between friend and foe became increasingly blurred. As the investigation into the disappearances gathered momentum, the focus on Abboud and Khajawa intensified. Their home was watched more closely, and their movements were reported to the authorities. The couple, aware of the growing scrutiny, became more cautious, but the tide of suspicion was difficult to stem. The community, once bound by ties of kinship and mutual support, now found itself united by fear. In the end, it was this collective vigilance that would prove decisive. The people of Mosul, driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and a desire for justice, played a crucial role in bringing the couple's actions to light. Their story, shaped by the extraordinary circumstances of the famine, remains a testament to the ways in which crisis can both fracture and forge the bonds of community. As we move forward, we will explore how these suspicions gave way to concrete action, how law enforcement and community leaders began to investigate, and how the city of Mosul confronted the reality of what had taken place within its midst. As the famine's shadow lengthened over Mosul, the city's collective psyche shifted from anxiety to outright fear. The pattern of disappearances, the rumors swirling around Abboud and Khajawa, and the unsettling sense that something was deeply wrong all combined to create an atmosphere of suspicion that touched every corner of the community. In ordinary times, Mosul's neighborhoods were close-knit. Families had lived side by side for generations, sharing in each other's joys and sorrows. But the famine had changed these relationships. Hunger, deprivation, and the daily struggle for survival had eroded the trust that once bound neighbors together. Now, every unexplained absence, every unfamiliar face, and every act of kindness was viewed through a lens of doubt. The rumors about Abboud and Khajawa were not the only ones circulating. In times of crisis, fear often breeds suspicion, and suspicion can quickly turn to accusation. Other families, too, found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and furtive glances. But the consistency and persistence of the stories about the couple set them apart. Their home, once unremarkable, had become a symbol of the city's unease. Community leaders, elders, religious figures, and respected merchants found themselves at the center of a growing storm. They were approached daily by residents seeking reassurance or demanding action. Some brought stories of missing relatives or friends. Others shared their observations of the couple's unusual behavior. The leaders listened, weighed the evidence, and debated how best to respond. The city's religious institutions played a particularly important role during this period. Mosques and churches, which had long served as centers of community life, became places where people gathered not only to pray, but to share information and seek guidance. Imams and priests urged their congregations to remain vigilant, to look out for one another, and to report anything suspicious to the authorities. At the same time, they cautioned against jumping to conclusions or taking the law into their own hands. Despite these calls for calm, the sense of fear continued to grow. Parents kept their children indoors, and women traveled in groups whenever possible. The city's markets, already diminished by the famine, became places of tense silence, where every transaction was conducted with an undercurrent of suspicion. The once familiar rhythms of daily life had been replaced by a constant state of alertness. It was in this environment that the first concrete steps toward investigation were taken. The city's police force, though limited in number and resources, began to take the reports of disappearances more seriously. Officers were assigned to gather information, interview witnesses, and keep a closer watch on the neighborhoods most affected by the rumors. The authorities, aware of the potential for panic, sought to proceed cautiously, balancing the need for action with the risk of inflaming tensions. The process was slow and painstaking. In many cases, there was little evidence to go on. No bodies, no witnesses, and no clear motive. The famine had created a situation in which people could vanish for any number of reasons, and distinguishing between those who had left voluntarily and those who had met with foul play was a daunting task. The police relied heavily on the testimony of neighbors, whose accounts were often colored by fear and speculation. Despite these challenges, a picture began to emerge. The pattern of disappearances, the reports of strangers entering Abboud and Khajawa's home, and the family's apparent immunity to the worst effects of the famine all pointed to the need for closer scrutiny. The authorities began to monitor the couple more closely, noting their movements and the comings and goings at their residence. The role of the community in this process cannot be overstated. In the absence of modern investigative tools, it was the vigilance of ordinary citizens that provided the most valuable information. Neighbors kept detailed records of who entered and left the couple's home, shared their observations with the police, and compared notes with one another. In some cases, they even organized informal patrols, taking turns watching the house from a distance. This collective effort was not without its risks. The line between vigilance and vigilantism is a thin one, and there were moments when the situation threatened to spiral out of control. Some residents, frustrated by the slow pace of the investigation, advocated for more direct action. Others, fearful of retribution or of being accused themselves, hesitated to come forward with what they knew. The authorities, for their part, sought to maintain order and prevent the outbreak of mob justice. They urged patience, promising that the investigation would be thorough and fair. At the same time, they recognized the urgency of the situation. The longer the disappearances continued, the greater the risk that fear would give way to chaos. As the investigation progressed, the focus on Abboud and Khajawa intensified. The couple, aware that they were under scrutiny, became more guarded in their behavior. They limited their interactions with neighbors, kept their son close, and took steps to avoid drawing attention to themselves. But the damage had already been done. In the eyes of many, their guilt was all but certain. The psychological toll of this period was immense. For the people of Mosul, the knowledge that danger could lurk behind any door was a source of constant anxiety. The city's children, once free to roam the streets, now played only under the watchful eyes of their parents. The bonds of trust that had once defined the community were frayed to the breaking point. Yet even in the midst of fear, there were moments of solidarity. Neighbors looked out for one another, sharing what little they had and offering comfort in times of distress. Community leaders worked tirelessly to maintain order and prevent the outbreak of violence. The city's religious institutions provided a sense of stability and hope, reminding residents of their shared humanity in the face of unimaginable hardship. The investigation into Abboud and Khajawa's activities would soon reach a turning point. The evidence, painstakingly gathered by the authorities and the community, would lead to a series of events that would forever change the city of Mosul. But for now, the people waited, caught between fear and hope, suspicion and solidarity, as they confronted the darkest days of the famine. In the next part, we will follow the investigation as it gathers momentum and see how law enforcement and community leaders work together to uncover the truth behind the disappearances that haunted Mosul. As the weeks passed and the list of missing persons grew, the investigation into the disappearances in Mosul became more focused and determined. The city's police force, though limited in both manpower and resources, recognized that the situation had reached a critical point. The pressure from community leaders and the growing unrest among the population left the authorities with little choice but to act decisively. The first step was to formalize the collection of information. Police officers began to systematically interview residents in the neighborhoods most affected by the disappearances. They visited homes, questioned families, and took careful notes on the movements of those who had last been seen in the vicinity of Abboud and Khajawa's house. The process was slow, hampered by the general atmosphere of fear and suspicion, but gradually, a clearer picture began to emerge. Community leaders played a crucial role in this phase of the investigation. Elders, religious figures, and respected merchants acted as intermediaries, encouraging residents to come forward with information and vouching for the credibility of witnesses. In a society where trust had been deeply eroded by famine, these leaders provided a vital link between the authorities and the people. Their involvement helped to reassure those who might otherwise have been reluctant to speak, and their knowledge of the community's social fabric allowed the police to focus their efforts more effectively. One of the key breakthroughs came when several witnesses independently reported seeing individuals enter Abboud and Khajawa's home, only for those individuals never to be seen again. These accounts, while circumstantial, were consistent and detailed. Some witnesses described the visitors as travelers or beggars, people who were already vulnerable and unlikely to be missed. Others noted the couple's son inviting people to the house, often under the pretense of sharing food or offering shelter. The police began to keep the couple's home under discreet surveillance. Officers, sometimes in plain clothes, observed the comings and goings at all hours. They noted the times when the family left the house, the visitors who arrived, and any unusual activity. The authorities also quietly questioned those who had interacted with the family, seeking to establish a timeline and identify any patterns. As the investigation progressed, the authorities faced significant challenges. The famine had left the city's institutions stretched to the breaking point. Many police officers were themselves struggling to feed their families, and morale was low. The risk of false accusations was ever present, and the authorities were acutely aware of the potential for panic or mob violence if the investigation was mishandled. Despite these obstacles, the evidence against Abboud and Khajawa continued to mount. The police compiled a list of missing persons who had last been seen in the vicinity of the couple's home. They cross-referenced this list with witness statements and reports from community leaders. The pattern was unmistakable. A disproportionate number of disappearances could be traced back to the same location. The authorities also began to examine the couple's means of subsistence. In a city where hunger was universal, Abboud and Khajawa's apparent ability to provide for themselves and their son stood out. The family's access to food, their relatively healthy appearance, and their willingness to offer hospitality to strangers all raised questions. The police discreetly inquired about the couple's sources of income, their connections to local merchants, and any unusual purchases or transactions. At the same time, the authorities sought to maintain order and prevent the spread of rumors. They issued public statements urging calm and promising a thorough investigation. Religious leaders echoed these calls, reminding the community of the importance of justice and due process. The city's newspapers, though limited in their reach, reported cautiously on the investigation, careful not to inflame tensions or jeopardize the work of the police. The turning point came when a group of neighbors, acting on their own initiative, confronted the couple about the disappearances. According to later testimony, the confrontation was tense but non-violent. The neighbors demanded to know the whereabouts of several missing individuals and pressed the couple for an explanation. Abboud and Khajawa denied any involvement, insisting that they were as concerned as anyone about the fate of their neighbors. The police, alerted to the confrontation, intervened quickly. They escorted the couple to the local station for questioning, both to protect them from potential harm and to advance the investigation. The couple's son was also taken into protective custody, a decision that reflected both concern for his welfare and the need to gather information. The interrogation of Abboud and Khajawa was conducted with care. The authorities were aware of the gravity of the accusations and the need for clear evidence. Over the course of several days, the couple was questioned separately and together. They were asked about their activities, their sources of food, and their interactions with the missing individuals. The police also questioned their son, seeking to determine his role, if any, in the events under investigation. During this period, the authorities searched the couple's home. They looked for any evidence that might link the family to the disappearances, personal belongings of the missing, records of transactions, or other physical clues. The search was thorough, and the findings would later play a significant role in the legal proceedings that followed. The arrest of Abboud and Khajawa sent shockwaves through Mosul. News of the investigation spread quickly, fueled by word of mouth and the city's small but active press. For many residents, the arrest was both a relief and a cause for renewed anxiety. On the one hand, it offered the hope that the mystery of the disappearances might finally be solved. On the other, it raised uncomfortable questions about the depths of desperation to which the famine had driven members of their own community. The authorities, mindful of the potential for unrest, took steps to reassure the public. They emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and that all suspects would be treated fairly. Community leaders echoed these assurances, urging residents to remain patient and to trust in the process of justice. As the investigation moved into its final phase, the focus shifted from gathering evidence to preparing for trial. The authorities compiled their findings, interviewed additional witnesses, and worked to build a case that would stand up in court. The story of Abboud and Khajawa, once the subject of rumor and speculation, was now a matter of public record. In the next part, we will explore the arrest and interrogation accounts in greater detail, examining how the authorities sought to uncover the truth and how the community responded to the unfolding drama. The arrest of Abboud and Khajawa marked a pivotal moment in Mosul's ordeal. For months, the city had been gripped by fear and uncertainty, its people haunted by the unexplained disappearances and the gnawing suspicion that something terrible was unfolding in their midst. Now, with the couple in custody, the focus shifted from rumor to revelation as the authorities sought to uncover the truth through careful interrogation and investigation. The initial questioning of Abboud and Khajawa was conducted at the city's main police station, a modest building that had become the nerve center of the investigation. The couple was separated and questioned individually, a standard practice designed to prevent them from coordinating their stories. The police, aware of the gravity of the accusations, approached the task with a mix of determination and caution. They knew that the eyes of the entire city were upon them, and that any misstep could have serious consequences. The interrogations were methodical. Investigators began by asking about the couple's daily routines, their sources of food, and their interactions with the missing individuals. They pressed for details about the visitors who had been seen entering their home, and about the family's apparent ability to weather the famine better than most. The couple maintained their innocence, insisting that they had done nothing wrong, and that they too were victims of the famine's hardships. As the questioning continued, the authorities presented the couple with the evidence that had been gathered: witness statements, records of missing persons, and the results of the search of their home. The police had found personal belongings that could be linked to some of the missing individuals, items that, in the context of the investigation, raised serious questions. Abboud and Khajawa offered explanations for each item, claiming that they had been left behind by visitors or acquired through barter. The authorities, however, remained skeptical. The couple's son was also questioned, though with greater sensitivity given his age. Investigators sought to determine whether he had played a role in luring victims to the house, and whether he had any knowledge of his parents' alleged activities. The boy's responses were hesitant and sometimes contradictory, reflecting the confusion and fear that he must have felt. Some accounts suggest that he was deeply traumatized by the experience, and that his testimony was shaped as much by his desire to protect his parents as by any clear recollection of events. As news of the arrest spread, the city of Mosul was gripped by a mixture of relief, curiosity, and renewed anxiety. For many residents, the detention of Abboud and Khajawa confirmed their worst fears: that the disappearances were not random but the result of deliberate and calculated actions. The city's markets, mosques, and public squares buzzed with conversation as people shared what they had heard and speculated about what might come next. The local press, though limited in its reach, reported cautiously on the case. Editors were mindful of the need to avoid inflaming tensions or prejudicing the investigation. Nevertheless, the details that did emerge about the couple's arrest, the evidence found in their home, and the ongoing interrogations were enough to fuel a wave of rumor and speculation. In a city already on edge, every new piece of information was dissected and debated, often with little regard for accuracy or fairness. Rumors spread quickly, taking on a life of their own. Some claimed that the couple had confessed to the crimes, while others insisted that they were being framed by jealous neighbors or rivals. Stories circulated about the methods the couple had allegedly used to lure their victims, and about the role of their son in the events. In the absence of official statements, these rumors filled the void, shaping public perception and adding to the sense of unease. The authorities, aware of the dangers posed by unchecked speculation, sought to manage the flow of information. They issued statements urging the public to remain calm and to refrain from spreading unverified stories. Religious and community leaders echoed these calls, reminding residents of the importance of justice and due process. Yet the hunger for answers was strong, and the boundaries between fact and rumor remained porous. The psychological impact of the case was profound. For many in Mosul, the arrest of Abboud and Khajawa was both a relief and a source of new anxieties. The knowledge that such acts could occur within their own community, and that a seemingly ordinary family could be at the center of such a tragedy, was deeply unsettling. Parents became even more protective of their children, and neighbors watched one another with renewed suspicion. At the same time, the case prompted a broader reflection on the effects of the famine. Many residents saw in the story of Abboud and Khajawa a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation and the breakdown of social bonds. The famine had not only brought hunger and disease, but had also eroded the moral fabric of the community, making possible acts that would have been unthinkable in better times. The authorities continued their investigation, seeking to corroborate the evidence and build a case that would stand up in court. They interviewed additional witnesses, re-examined the physical evidence, and consulted with legal and religious experts. The process was painstaking, but the stakes were high. The outcome of the case would not only determine the fate of Abboud and Khajawa, but would also set a precedent for how the community responded to crisis and crime. As the date of the trial approached, the city braced itself for what was to come. The case had become a focal point for the anxieties and fears that had been building for months. For some, it was an opportunity to seek justice and restore a sense of order. For others, it was a reminder of the fragility of life and the thin line that separates survival from tragedy. In the next and final part, we will follow the trial and sentencing of Abboud and Khajawa, the impact of their execution on the city's memory, and the lessons that their story continues to offer about human behavior in times of extreme hardship. The trial of Abboud and Khajawa began in the spring of 1917, drawing the attention of all Mosul. The city, still reeling from the effects of famine and the recent wave of disappearances, watched closely as the couple was brought before the Ottoman court. The proceedings were held in a modest courthouse, but the significance of the case was felt far beyond its walls. For many, this was not only a trial of two individuals, but a reckoning with the trauma and moral collapse that the famine had brought upon the community. The court, presided over by Ottoman officials and attended by local religious leaders, sought to balance the demands of justice with the need for order. The evidence presented was a combination of witness testimony, physical findings from the couple's home, and the accounts gathered during the investigation. Neighbors and community members took the stand, recounting the disappearances, the suspicious activities around the couple's house, and the items found that belonged to the missing. Abboud and Khajawa, for their part, maintained their innocence throughout the proceedings. They insisted that they had only tried to survive like everyone else, and that the items found in their home had been acquired through barter or left behind by visitors. Their son, too, was called to testify, his words marked by confusion and distress. The court took care to shield him from the harshest aspects of the proceedings, recognizing his youth and the trauma he had endured. The trial was conducted with a seriousness that reflected the gravity of the charges. The judges listened carefully to the evidence, questioned witnesses, and consulted with legal and religious authorities. The city's religious leaders, representing both Muslim and Christian communities, were present to ensure that the proceedings were fair and that the outcome would be accepted by the broader population. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in Mosul was tense. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for news and discussing the latest developments. The local press reported cautiously, aware of the need to avoid inflaming passions or prejudicing the outcome. Rumors continued to circulate, but the focus now shifted to the question of justice. What punishment, if any, would be appropriate for the accused, and what lessons could be drawn from their actions? After several days of testimony and deliberation, the court reached its verdict. Abboud and Khajawa were found guilty of multiple counts related to the disappearances and deaths of several individuals. The evidence, while circumstantial in some respects, was deemed sufficient to establish their responsibility. The court's decision was announced publicly, and the sentence was clear: execution by hanging to be carried out in accordance with Ottoman law. The execution took place in the summer of 1917 in a public square near the center of Mosul. The event drew a large crowd, as was customary at the time for cases of such gravity. The authorities hoped that the public nature of the punishment would serve as a deterrent, reinforcing the rule of law and restoring a sense of order to a city shaken by fear and uncertainty. For many in Mosul, the execution of Abboud and Khajawa brought a measure of closure. The disappearances that had haunted the city for months were finally explained, and the sense of danger that had pervaded daily life began to recede. Yet the relief was tempered by a lingering sense of unease. The case had revealed not only the capacity for wrongdoing in times of crisis, but also the vulnerability of the community to fear, rumor, and the breakdown of trust. In the years that followed, the story of Abboud and Khajawa became part of Mosul's collective memory. It was recounted in homes and marketplaces, in sermons and stories, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation and the importance of solidarity. For some, the couple became symbols of the moral collapse that can occur when society is pushed to its limits. For others, their story was a reminder of the need for compassion and understanding, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. The case also entered the region's folklore, taking on new layers of meaning as it was retold over generations. In some versions, Abboud and Khajawa were portrayed as victims of circumstance, driven to their actions by forces beyond their control. In others, they were cast as warnings against the dangers of greed, isolation, and the abandonment of communal values. The details of the case were sometimes embellished or altered, but the core message remained. Famine and desperation can drive people to acts that defy comprehension. Historians and social scientists have since studied the case as an example of how extreme conditions can erode the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The famine that struck Mosul was not unique in its effects. Similar stories have emerged from other times and places where hunger and deprivation have tested the limits of human endurance. The story of Abboud and Khajawa is thus both particular to its time and place, and universal in its implications. The psychological impact of famine is now better understood. Hunger not only weakens the body, but also clouds judgment, undermines social bonds, and can lead to a sense of isolation and hopelessness. In such conditions, the normal rules of behavior may no longer apply, and individuals may be driven to actions they would once have found unthinkable. The case of Abboud and Khajawa stands as a stark reminder of these dangers, yet the story is also one of resilience. In the aftermath of the trial and execution, the people of Mosul worked to rebuild their community, to restore trust, and to care for those most affected by the famine. Religious and community leaders redoubled their efforts to provide support and guidance, and families reached out to one another in acts of solidarity and compassion. The memory of the tragedy served as a catalyst for renewal, a reminder of the importance of mutual aid and the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Today, more than a century later, the story of Abboud and Khajawa continues to resonate. It is studied by historians, recounted in local folklore, and remembered by families whose ancestors lived through those difficult years. The case remains a powerful example of how crisis can reveal both the best and the worst in human nature, and of the enduring need for empathy, justice, and community. The story of Abboud and Khajawa is not only a tale of crime, it is a reminder of what famine and desperation can drive human beings to become. As we close this chapter on the story of Abboud and Khajawa, we invite you to reflect on the questions it raises about human nature, community, and survival in times of crisis. Stories like this one remind us that history is not just about dates and events, but about real people, families, neighbors, and communities facing unimaginable choices. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons do you take from this story? How do you think communities can support one another in times of hardship? Have you heard similar stories from your own country or family history? Share your reflections in the comments or join the conversation on our social media channels. Your insights help us all learn from the past and understand the complexities of human behavior. Thank you for listening and for being part of our history community. If you found this series meaningful, please consider sharing it with others who are interested in true stories from history. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, history lives on in the stories we tell and the lessons we carry forward.